Hello everyone, this is the Diatone GT Rabbit R239, also known as the R90. Featuring the Fury F4 flight controller with an OSD, Runcam Micro Swift camera, Runcam TX200U power switchable 25 and 200 milliwatts, F25 20 amp ESC, Mamba Racing 1105 5500 kV motors, a collaboration between Rotor X and Gem Fan on these 1940 props. Comes with an XT30 for your battery connection, Diatone battery strap, comes with some extra zip ties. I believe these are gummies for your battery, a single male end for an XT30, two M2 nuts, a connector for your ESC and flight controller, an optional buzzer, a nice little schematic, pinout for the F4 Fury, and stickers. As we get started on the flight, I want to mention one thing before we get too deep is there is going to be some wonderful crash testing in this flight video. I do have a little bit of a bounce off the ground in this particular video, but I'm actually going to run it into the shed, and then it's going to be colder, and I'm going to run it into the garage door in the front, and then we're going to have snow and super cold, and I'm going to crash it into the garage door, and we'll see what the results are. We do a little bit of testing there, and that was something that Diatone asked me to do. They wanted to see crash testing. They've got some very interesting materials here they've used, and for this quad to be durable, I think what they've gone with is, well, what they've obviously gone with is a frame made of some sort of plastic flexible material. And due to that plastic flexible material, there is going to be a little bit of a tune challenge, and it's also going to be very sensitive to weight of your battery because that changes the dynamic of possibly the geometry of where the motors are. Every once in a while you do see a black flash in my DVR, and I have a sneaking suspicion that I was flying something and it required a legacy mode on my rapid fire module. So please excuse that. I do not believe that is a function of this quad, but rather how my DVR is responding to the fact that I have probably legacy mode 1 or 2 on because of something else I was flying on the same day. Shout out to Albert Kim. When I first got this, I had some troubles with the tuning. Diatone had sent a tune on it, and they'd sent me a tune via Facebook chat, and I had all sorts of troubles. It was dropping an arm, it was loose, it was kind of all over the place. I had a lot of difficulties, and after going back and forth with them for a while, they did mention that Albert had one, so I reached out to Albert, and he said, yeah, I'm paraphrasing here, I'm not quoting Albert. He said there was something off with the tune, so he just flashed it and reset it up, and so after I did that, there was something odd that they must have done, I'm guessing via command line somewhere, to just make it not tune like I'm used to, so I couldn't correct it or make it fly like I wanted to, but eventually I did get there after taking Albert's advice and flashing and just starting over. So I'm running Betaflight 3.5.2, and I am also running props out, and I will put the PIDs on screen if you happen to get one. Now, of course, if you get one that's not prop guarded, it's going to be a completely different tune. You'll probably have much different values, but we see we get to the 2.5 minute mark, and our 450 milliamp GNB 3S battery is pretty much tired, and we got to come in for a land. So let's jump into some crash testing. Not only we're going to crash it a few times, I've got the field cam too, and we'll review that here and we're done. But I run it into the shed, and I hit it pretty smack dab pretty hard a few times. You might be wondering why the shed, not the tree, because the tree is usually something that I run into, a little bit of a target practice. And Diatone did say that it needs to run up against something flat, and that was the testing that they wanted to see. So I'm always obliged to give them some sort of feedback in what they're looking to see, and so I do the crash testing as desired. I do think they have a point because of how they designed the prop guard. It's rounded at the front, and I looked like at least in one of those crashes, I hit the handles of the shed, which is a bad spot. So that simulates a little bit of a roundness of a tree there. But I do this repeatedly, just hitting into the shed. I'm not going full out, but I'm going at a pretty good clip. And I did this actually a few times, but unfortunately, I forgot to hit record on my field cam, so I think there was 4 crashes where I don't have the field cam footage before I heard it. I heard the camera over my shoulder beep, and then I knew that, I forgot to hit the record button, so I went over and hit the record button, and we did a few more crashes. I think it was 2 more, and then we can jump into the field cam footage of those nicer days. And when I say nicer days, I'm talking that these days we're probably right around the 50-degree marker, and that is Fahrenheit. So as you can tell in those crashes, they were pretty dramatic and kind of fun to watch. Let's go over to the cold weather flights now, where I crashed it into the garage doors out front. And I crashed it into the garage doors because that's the only dry area. We got about six, maybe even 7 inches of snow. The weather here can be crazy. I was telling a number of people on Facebook because I posted an image. It was 63 and sunny and calm and just so nice. It was shorts weather. And then by morning, we're getting snow, it's windy, and it's like 29 degrees. It can be ridiculous here. So all these crashes so far have been on one frame, and it's been on the transparent frame. And I did have a few breakages, and we'll take a look at those when we get back to the desk. But I wanted to see one other thing when, as far as the cold weather crashing that I do, I wanted to know if I had possibly weakened the frame, because it did break when I hit the garage door on the colder day. And it on the day where I still had the transparent frame, it was about 30, 32 degrees when I was doing those crashing. But the next day, it's actually colder. But I put on the black frame, which you've already seen in the quick roll so far, and I crashed it 2 more times. And on the second crash, I do have a breakage, and we'll show you that here at the desk as soon as we get done watching the field cam from these garage door crashes. So we're back here at the desk, and we've got the frames out, and one of the crashes that I can't claim I know when it occurred is this one right here. And actually, when you move it around like this, it feels fairly flimsy and flexible, but when I had it on the frame, I didn't notice that at all. I saw the crack as I started to transfer the components over here, so I'm not certain when this one happened. I presume it happened at the same time that this broke right here. And that was on the final crash on the first cold weather day before I transferred the frames. And you should be able to tell that if you go back and watch the footage. You should be able to see the black prop guard in view on the 2 final crashes. So we did have a breakage, and the reason why I think I covered it, but I wanted to see if I'd weakened this frame with all the crashing I had done in the backyard. And then when I went to the front yard, I'd reached some sort of level where it just couldn't maintain its integrity anymore. So we swapped it over. We did 2 more crashes. Diatone has rated this to where you should be able to crash it into something flat in -5 degrees C, which I think comes in around 24 degrees Fahrenheit. And on that second day, I did crash it, and it was about 26 degrees according to the weather data that I have. And what's interesting is you also saw in that video that after I had that crash and the flight controller reset, I went ahead and flew it around just to make sure it was okay, because that was also something I wanted to know was, with the flight controller reset, did it actually damage the flight controller or one of the components or something of that nature? And I flew it a couple of times since, just kind of putting around because we do have a lot of snow still out on the ground. That's some additional data points. And the funny thing is, I used to have a zip tie right back here, and this area didn't even probably make, well, it could have made impact, I guess, when it hit the ground and flipped over, but it snapped my zip tie off. So this is how I used to have the antennas mounted. It snapped that off, and then it broke this one piece up front here. Where did it go? Oh, it's this part right here. Right here is where it broke, and it flies fine still like this. I also did some dive testing that you can watch in this top right hand corner, and with props out and the PID tune that I put on there, I didn't have any problems with yaw washout. That's something that we'll oftentimes see when we have prop guards, but it appears as though the prop guards on this don't create enough aerodynamic force in order to cause any sort of problems. I didn't do any tuning specifically for the yaw washout. Initially on the Diatone tune, I had all sorts of issues with arms dropping on fast corners and things of that nature, so that PID tune that I showed on screen, that would be a pretty good starting point should you happen to have one of these. Also, my props in several of the crashes, they were these clear ones that it came with because it only shipped with one set of props. And then when I was the night I received this, I ordered some more props because these I don't have many of, actually any. So you can see how these props, they've been all sorts of damage. So if you notice any vibrations on those run-ups to the crashes, it's probably due to these props. They're completely hosed. They're bent out of shape. They're fairly well damaged, but they did hold together. That's something I can say for them. They didn't snap a blade off or anything of that nature. They just kept taking damage crash after crash. So that's something to be said. But I did have these fresh props as they came in for the 2 final crashes, so it may have looked a bit smoother there, and that would be the difference that you see. We're at the point where we've seen quite a bit, and I think it would be a good idea if you wanted to pause the video and maybe leave your comment down below, giving some feedback of what do you think? What's your takeaway from the crashes and the conditions that you've seen so far? And are you surprised? Are you disappointed? Anything of that, so you might want to pause the video and do that now before we resume the rest of the video. For me, one of the things I took away is none of the electronic components were damaged. We even had the flight controller reset, and everything still works just fine. Nothing looks like it's going to come apart. I think the camera protection that they built in here is really smart. You don't see any of the camera protection in your view, and the camera's fine. And I was going headlong into that stuff, and as you can see, this is going to bend up and provide you a little bit of an extra layer of protection. Unless you come in at such an extreme angle that it were to get in this way, then your camera might be a little bit more exposed. If you're flying at nearly 90 degrees, you might find that the camera gets hit in that fashion against something narrow. And as far as the crash testing against a flat surface versus a tree, yes, the tree I would acknowledge is much more real-world testing, but I think the crash testing into the flat surface, because how many times are you actually going to center this? Typically, we're going to crash and we're not going to necessarily center. Hopefully, we're making a correction so we don't center that stuff and we end up hitting on one of the sides. And in that regard, I think testing against the front side of the prop guard and the integrity of the arms and everything, that's a pretty good test. I give it high marks. You know, I counted the number of crashes on the warm days, and it was probably about 8. And then I had 2 more in cold weather, and then I swapped frames and had 2 more. And we did have the breakages, but they were actually relatively minor, in my opinion. I think structurally on the King Kong series, those hoops that they had on those were actually more compromised in their crashes because it essentially rendered the whole hoop defunct, where you'd have to move it to maybe the rear and then hope that you don't come down on anything on the rear or in that side or something of that nature. And this being all one unit helps to it keeps that integrity so you can continue to fly that particular day and still have some more crashes, and you'll probably be fine. You just might need some extra props. In true Diatone fashion, they've used high quality components. I love how they tend to gold plate some of their things, you know. That's kind of an interesting touch. You might feel strongly one way or another about that. I did increase the stiffness with a zip tie cutoff and then heat shrunk to the VTX antenna. And then obviously my receiver antennas went 90 degrees, one out the back, one out the top. Pretty straightforward and simple. I did add some strain relief to the rear because I figured I was going to have some battery ejections, which I actually didn't have, but you can see on my dual lock it did tear most of the dual lock off. And I get that from, I think it's Fine Tape or finetapes.com. I usually buy like a roll that's 10 meters or something like that, and it'll last me almost a year. The frame is quite flexible. It's fairly interesting, and you know, this is probably the most rigid part because they have these 2 areas that come down vertically, but it's still a little bit flexible. And this one, of course, we have the 1 breakage here, so we have 2 different breakages in those crashes. But my particular stance is, if you're someone who's looking to get into FPV and this is something that attracts you for its durability, I would say it's a pretty good choice. I think the premium components and the nice smooth motors that they have on this, you could take this when you get familiar with your flying or you're comfortable enough, and you could swap this over to another frame. They've routed the motor wires underneath and then around, so you should be able to fly this without even desoldering anything on, say, a frame that runs a 2.5-inch prop. They're 5500 kV motors, so not real high kV, but if you go to a 2.5-inch prop, I think your performance will really jump. We've got, like I said, some nice quality components. You've got smart audio for your VTX. It goes up to 200 milliwatts. A lot of people are looking for that. That's a run cam combination between our camera and our VTX. When you transfer components, the part that I would say that's going to stick out a little bit is Diatone, they soft mount. That's another thing you need to remember, is soft mounting helps keep vibration down out of your stack. But back to disassembling, is they use these little tiny rings, and that can be a little bit cumbersome in order to get your components stacked up on top of there. I would say when you go to do that, just disconnect the flight controller from the ESC, that little connector that's down in there. Disconnect this little connector right down here from the flight controller and ESC. That'll make it a lot easier. That way you can set it down flat, and then you'll be able to, maybe you put some tape over the screws or something of that nature to keep the screws poked up, and then you can start putting your stack back together. I would like to see these be hex screws like they are everywhere else rather than Phillips. It just makes it a little bit easier. They do seem to be high quality components. And also look at these screws. They're a bit beveled. If you can see that on the edges, they're not sharp. They're kind of beveled there on the edges. And you get a stack of extra screws as well. And they have Loctite on the screws as well. So they've gone that extra step in order to give us that extra security of making sure that those screws don't come loose, at least in most cases. The buzzer that I showed you in the quick roll, you would connect that to this little lead that comes off of the flight controller and ESC combination harness. So you'd plug that in, and then you need to find somewhere to squirrel it away. Depending upon your receiver, I'm using an XM Plus. You could just use another piece of foam tape and put it right down here. It does seem as though this lead is plenty long to where you could plug it in this way. So the connector would come in that way, and then you'd have your buzzer over here, because natively it does not have a buzzer. So finding your quad, if it goes down the big pile of leaves, as it did for me several times, it might be a little bit easier to find it if you do connect that buzzer. But it's nice that they give us that option at the very least. We don't have to buy something extra. We have some text here in the top to indicate our model and the edition. I don't know what the 1755 means, but okay. It's a little bit of a cool feature. Also, I should say, when it comes to the frame, like if you just want to get the frame and you want to buy your own components and build your own, the part that's probably most cumbersome and in just the plastic components is getting this canopy piece into this mount piece, because those are separate, and it takes quite a bit of force to get it down there as far as you see it. Hopefully you can see that tiny little gap in there. There's just there it is. There's the tiny little gap. So that's the distance you want to have the canopy pressed into this bottom mount, because as you see here, it mounts back here. So you want to have that as secure as you can in order to maintain the integrity and the durability and the whatever rigidity you can get out of this. And like I said, when this was broken, I didn't notice it. I didn't notice this was broken until I started taking things apart to transfer it over here. So at the point where I stopped flying this frame, it was actually because of this piece. I've got it backwards. This piece right over here that broke earlier. I think if you get one of these and you break it, you can use your favorite adhesive to fix. Like I've got this little breakage in here. I tend to use welder. I've been using this for quite a while, repairing different plastics, especially on hoops of various sorts, and you can pick some of this from Amazon. I'll have a link down in the description if you're an Amazon shopper. I believe they sell these in packages of 2 tubes, and they're like $6 or $7, and they do go quite a ways. What I do when I use this stuff is I just take like a sticky note or a piece of paper and I squeeze a little bit on there, and then I take either a broken prop and clip it off, and then I use the prop in order to get it where I need it, or I'll take the end of a zip tie from cutting it off in installations like this, and I'll use whatever I've got laying around, and I'll put some on the inside, let that stick together, and then I'll just kind of wrap the whole thing in this welder adhesive. And the reason why I use welder, many of you have probably heard this before, is that it stays flexible, so it's not going to snap. It adheres a lot better than hot glue. I know other people are using shoe glue has been mentioned, super glue has been mentioned, tape has been mentioned. What else is there? E6000 that has been mentioned. I've got some of that as well. The E6000 will stay flexible as well, but I just don't find it adheres as well. So I don't think that the E6000 actually helps to maintain the rigidity. It's more likely to give and stretch and then come back. The E6000, when it dries, it just feels kind of foamy or spongy to me, whereas this feels like it's got a little bit more consistency with the adhesive, so it might give way, but I don't think the welder would give way as much as the E6000 would as far as that initial movement upon impact. So I do think that a quad like this is going to give someone the great ability to spend a lot of time flying and training and not repairing. It is a premium trainer, and I'll put a link down in the description to the various places I can find that sells this. If you have any comments, questions, suggestions, or otherwise, please let me know in that section down below. I appreciate your time, and thanks for watching.